skeptics, the believers, the fanatics, etc., etc. This is Rick, the Fat Man, and I am doing my literal opinion on Bob Lazar's story, taking it literally as if I'm not debating a whole lot of his claims or stuff, but there are elements in it, in the story, and in Bob Lazar himself, that we really need to examine in order to find it a middle ground to be literal on. One of the most I find this to be interesting and ironic in from a lot of perspectives, that the most controversial things about Bob Lazar is not his claims to having seen what he's seen, or worked on what he worked on, or his career or lack thereof. It has to do with his education or lack thereof. And if you can't find information on the man and where he says he got his education, where he got his degrees, very commonplace things, then obviously there's something going on. Either he's lying through his teeth, and he's very, very good at it, because the man, I spent the last week since my first video watching various interviews with Bob Lazar, as well as some of those key, like the reporter Knox, or whatever his name is, and how their roles in the Bob Lazar story influences or enhances what we're looking at here. And there's so many things that you just struggle with, right? The fact that you can't be 100% sure on a lot of things. Of all the interviews that I've seen, and I've only seen about a dozen bits and pieces, as well as a couple hour-long bits and pieces, and of him giving, lectures or responding to questions and answers, including the most recent with Joe Rogan, of course. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, just Google Bob Lazar interviews, and you'll find that there are a lot of them that go back. And the lion's share of his story, while the details can flicker back and forth, they can alter slightly, but the gist and the meat of his story stays consistent, which for somebody who's, he really doesn't seem like the type who's looking for fame and glory, because obviously fame and glory did not come to him in the traditional methods, although I'm not going to say he doesn't gain from having with this stuff out there. But look at Bob Lazar and some of his education. Okay. Yeah, bear with me on this. I have notes, of course, and they're a bit scattered, because I'm your average Joe Q public. I'm not some fancy reporter or some fancy or some highly educated what have you, or any of that nature. So this is why I say it's my opinion and my take on things. One of those things that he's very vague on is names of people, details of his education, right? I mean, we're looking at some interesting things like, okay, nobody to yet that I've seen in an interview have asked Bob Lazar to describe the hallways or the settings within Caltech or within MIT. For those majority of us who've never sat in these hallowed halls of education, we don't know what the cafeteria looks like. We don't know, what lecture halls are nearby to what, physical facilities is there, specific buildings. Now, from my own experience of going to college, I cannot tell you the name of any of the buildings. I know that I took a number of different courses. Some of them are additional courses that are not pertinent to the education that I took. So I went into, like I said, computer-aided design. It's called CAD Tech, and yet I was also required to take, in addition to extra math classes, because I never took algebra or geometry, statistics, and other similar mathematic courses in high school, because algebra really turned me off. I was utterly confused by it until I got older, and I had an uncle tell me when I was working for a company for years loading trucks. He says, "How do you know to distribute the load?" And I looked at him and I kind of rattled off how the knowing the size of the truck, the length of the trailer, the weight. You only put so much weight in the nose, so much in the back end. Based on the state I'm from, the back end of a 53-foot trailer is usually only loaded to the 48-foot mark because they don't want excess weight in the back, which you can distribute these things. And he says, well, then you know how algebra works. And through that, I kind of got a grip enough to get enough of a grade in algebra and the secondary classes I needed to take to proceed. But among those, I also took a couple courses one on creative writing, one on corporate writer, industrial writing. It's how you write blueprints and instruction manuals and things of that nature. So you needed to take a few courses of pertinent material to what you're trying to get a degree in. I'm sure there's a much more sophisticated and fancy way of saying that stuff, and yes, I'm a babbling idiot. So if you guys got a better idea or a better concept of what I'm trying to get across, I'm more than happy to let you put it in the comments. But there are other ways of getting an education, and some of them are acceptable and not. And there's other reasons. There's many reasons, good reasons why a man like Bob Lazar may be reluctant to blatantly put out, this is my curriculum, this is what I did, A to B to B to B to B to C to D to D, etc. And these are the people that I worked with. I was in a class that started out close to 25 people. By the end of my 2 years, there was only about 19 of us left. Some of them dropped out, some became disinterested, life got in the way, what have you. There were several people who took the courses ad hoc. And what I mean by that is that in the college, if you have a certain amount of seats available, and there's either in the middle of or at the beginning of a particular class, if somebody fails to show up or cancels and there's an empty seat, if you are a private person and have an interest in learning that particular element of something, you can pick up that seat. Of course, you're paying for it, and you're not following the curriculum. That means you're only in for that semester for that particular class, and because you're interested in it, or it's a pickup class, like you already have a career in computer drafting and you want to brush up on the latest stuff. So you could come in and you could purchase that seat and sit down and go through the class without having completed an entire degree. Right. So anyway, Bob's vague on names, people, places, details. Said you never hear anybody ask about the descriptions of the buildings and what he's around. Another thing, I've yet to have any ask about his diploma, his plaques, his actual physical pieces of paper or fancy material, whatever it was printed on. Because when I graduated, I got several that showed my degree, my name, the school. It was meant to be framed and hung on a wall somewhere. Most professionals have these. Pretty much all professionals who have an actual degree have these things. Where's his? He doesn't mention them. Nobody asks him about it. Nobody asks, did somebody break into your house and steal your diplomas off your wall, or did you hang them in an office somewhere at Los Alamos, and when you left you forgot them, or did you take them to S4 and you never got them back? I mean, we never see anything like that. Another point: his apparent lack of high education in paper or documents doesn't mean that he doesn't have knowledge and skills that would not necessarily not net him a position at a place like S4 or Los Alamos. There are people in our society who are mechanically inclined, or who are savants or genetically or geniuses in their area of interest. These are people who just have a natural knack or knowledge thereof. I know some people who are automotive mechanics that just are geniuses at it because they love it. They love it, they eat it, they breathe it, and it comes naturally to them. I myself took a very short jog into automotive and diesel mechanics back in 1985 when I had an opportunity. An uncle of mine paid my way to get the initial outside student grant that I spent many years paying back to go to Lincoln Technical Institute of Automotive and Diesel Mechanics. There is a variant of the same company today that does marine motors and motorcycles that you see commercials for every now and then, actually usually late at night. The gist of this is that 30 or 40 people get crammed into a classroom. You go to school 6 hours a day to learn to be an automotive diesel mechanic, and in truth, you just work on a bunch of junk parts, learn to take them apart, put them back together. If you're lucky, you might get your own car into the shop, the school shop, where you can tinker with it, but there's no grade point value for doing so. And the majority of the people that I went to school with who graduated ended up working for places like Jiffy Lube, changing tires and greasing vehicles. So only a handful of people actually got onto dealerships or being automotive mechanics. Meanwhile, my local mechanic up the road doesn't have a plaque. He's not educated in a professional sense or an academic sense, but he's a bloody brilliant individual with a motor. He knows what he wants. He knows everything he needs to know, and he does good work for a reasonable price, and he has the patience to do so. That's another thing I discovered while I was trying to be an automotive mechanic, that I actually have no patience for it. I want my vehicle to run and start. I do not want to tinker with it. I don't want to have motor grease up to my elbows every day and being frustrated. That might be different if I was working on your vehicle and I could take my time, but you still understand that there's elements to being a natural inclination towards something. So you can have this skill, and it's obvious that if you watch anything of Bob Lazar, this man is mechanically, engineeringly inclined and has a scientific mind from his youth. The man built a jet bike, a rocket bike, a jet car. He built a hydrogen powered car. The list just keeps going on. He's also one of these people who don't seem to be obsessed with a formal education, because there's a pride factor in that. This view you're looking at right now is something to do with Caltech. And while I was thinking about this, there are people who go out of their way to tell you, oh, I graduated from Harvard University or Caltech or University of Iowa, and I did this and this, because they take very big pride in that. He doesn't seem like a guy that really cares one way or another where the education came from, and it probably makes me think he took classes as ad hoc as they came, as he was interested in, to gain additional knowledge in a specific field of something he had an interest in. That he was looking at going after a master's degree was secondary. The fact that he says he has 2 master's degrees, which you can be a physicist with a master's degree. You do not have to have a PhD. I mean, I've done a little more research on that in the last week, and I've discovered that it's possible to be a physicist in a field, be called a physicist, and do it so without having a PhD. And you can also get a master's degree in some methods that doesn't require you to do a thesis. You do not necessarily have to produce and publish a thesis, or even just produce one and turn one in order to get a degree. There are institutions, there are exceptions to the rule, and you can Google this and do a little bit. It didn't take a whole lot of Googling for me to come across that. So when I look at the guy, this reminded me of an uncle of mine who was self-educated. He barely graduated from high school, but he had a distinct interest in computers when they first came out. I remember he tried to interest most of my cousins into becoming computer programmers back in the day. This is when he had a TSR-80 in the basement, and we had a cassette tape player. So I'm just saying, right? The technology was very primitive. And he got this, for the lack of a better term, that was a Star Trek game that was just a bunch of icons on the screen, very crude. It was like a phone book. The whole program was already written for you, and all my cousin and I had to do was sit there and copy line for line the entire damn thing into the computer and save it, and then once it was all done, it would play. And it was interesting at the beginning. It was very anticlimactic after the fact, and it was very frustrating, which is one of the reasons I did not want to become a computer programmer. But my uncle, he taught himself how to do this. He taught himself how to program. Then he found a job where he could do and utilize that skill set that didn't require him to have a diploma. The people that hired him because he demonstrated his skill ability and had plenty of opportunities to do so, and they They just didn't care if he had the fancy piece of paper on the wall that said he needed to have it. But there are many places where that is part and parcel. But if you listen to Bob Lazar's initial headhunting story about how he gets turned in, we don't know about Los Alamos, how he got the job at Los Alamos. It's not very well detailed, and I have not seen anything conclusive. Is that he went and put an application in, etc., etc., etc. But he makes a point on numerous occasions. Do you think the people at Los Alamos hire somebody right out of high school? Do you think potentially, maybe, back in those days, there's a possibility that they could have? If he demonstrated a knack and one of his instructors at his high school was connected and had that information available to give to somebody who was looking for somebody who's somewhat of a genius in a very narrow set of parameters and think outside the box. The man constantly just demonstrates this. I'll have to do a different video on Bob Lazar's personality and his quirks and his habits and other things, because there's just so much information that we can look at, and this is just my personal opinion on all this stuff, right? So, and what I've been able to discover. So his apparent lack of high education does not mean that he didn't have knowledge and skills that would net him a position at S4 Los Alamos. I mean, it's true. He obviously has some chops, right? So another thing I wanted to know is there's been some conjecture amongst the detractors and the supporters, both of Bob Lazar, that the timeline doesn't work. When he claimed that he went to Caltech, when he claimed that he went to MIT, it didn't jive with the timeline of other events going on in his life. He had some lawsuits, he had some other stuff going down that are documented, and the fact that he spent most of his time on the West Coast or in the western half of the United States, there's not a lot of evidence of him spending a significant amount of time in Massachusetts to attend the MIT, because therein lies one of those stumbling blocks in his story that a lot of people like to wag fingers at. And I acknowledge that. I can't go into the great detail on it because it's so convoluted, and there's so much more stuff to research on, and I'm just one person, and it's just an interest thing. So I look at this and I thought, how else could you obtain a master's degree at MIT if you're not physically at the place? Well, keep in mind that a lot of these really high-level institutions of learning have satellite operations in other places. So whenever I Googled this, I wanted to see if MIT had a branch campus or some sort of official presence in California, and every time, no matter what way I type in the question into Google, Caltech comes up. Well, it doesn't outright say Caltech and MIT are co-joined at the hip. I got the impression that Caltech offers many courses that MIT either sponsors or recognizes. The fact that you could take the same course, like a secondary course, for example, I could take, when I went to the college, like I said, I had to take some additional math courses. Those math courses are accredited in any college, university that will accept them, pretty much carte blanche. So I would not have to go to another. If I went to follow up on my Associate of Applied Sciences degree to get a master's degree in engineering or design, I would not have to repeat those courses in another institution, because those other institutions will recognize the material that I took from my community college. And so the same thing could apply here, that it's possible that many of the courses he took to get his electronics master's at Caltech would translate over to his master's that he was pursuing for MIT. He would not need to take these classes twice. And so he would only need to take the premier classes, the core classes for, what was it? It wasn't engineering, was it something? Oh, I know what it is. I can't remember what it was. All right. So anyway, necessarily he could have taken some of these and then only had to attend MIT for specific course subject material in specific semesters. So he could have flown out and stayed for a while, took those courses. There's other possibilities where he was able to correspond. He could have taken some of those courses over the internet, though the internet was very poorly developed in that period of the late 80s, or through the mail, and then acquired those by testing at Caltech, as there's a term for that, where they proctor you, I believe is the term for it. So there's a possibility he could obtain his master's degree at MIT in a kind of haphazard manner. Which brings me to another thing. It's possible that he took a lot of these courses, the ones that interest him, and chose not to take the ones that were a waste of his time in his mind, which would prevent him from actually getting an actual formal diploma from MIT. But he would have one in all but name only. And he can make the argument to that and still claim to have a master's from MIT. There is that possibility. Whether or not it's, in his mind, it's acceptable. Doesn't mean it's true. So that's why I can sit here. After watching half dozen or so videos on Lazar, I noticed nobody's ever asked him, to describe these places. Whether it's Pierce Junior College, Caltech, MIT. And then I said, Google keeps referring to Caltech whenever I ask if MIT has any branch colleges in California. I'm just pointing out that that's my findings of what I found for that part of it. So, without comprehensive proof, is it possible Lazar didn't graduate from MIT and is unwilling to admit this? Did he only take some classes? So he says he has a master's degree, but we can't prove it. MIT has no evidence that he took classes, that has no proof. He has no plaque on the wall from MIT. He has no student ID that he can produce. None of this stuff has ever been, to my knowledge, of anything I've seen on the internet yet, and maybe I have not kicked on to the right keyword for that material, but nobody else seems to, in all these videos and clips and things I've been watching this past week. And one of my advantages to my job is that I travel around to service restaurants and other facilities. There are often a half hour to an hour long points of time where I'm in transit, and so I can listen to things on YouTube and Google stuff and get quite a bit of information this way. So I find the time, if I just need the question or the keywords to understand what it is to Google to get what I'm looking for. And then we talk about, like I said, is he self-educated? Obviously, a lot of what he did and does is just stuff. He's just a very savvy and smart individual who has a very deep interest in certain sets of mechanics and sciences. And in that aspect, he taught himself. He just did what he wanted to do. He wanted to develop a rocket bike. He built a rocket bike. He figured out how to do it. And in the process of doing so, learned a lot of interesting things that led him to translate to the next thing, which allowed him to build a bigger, fancier thing or doodad and learn more skills and so on and so forth. Like I said, my uncle never had a formal education aside high school, but he got the kits from Radio Shack back in the day, and he built his own scope and some kind of testing board, and it was a series of kits you bought, and he assembled all those and learned how to use these things to test electronics. He built a computer out of parts back before it was vogue to build computers, because he was interested in it. It never worked very well, but that's why he had the TSR-80, and then eventually went up into when the bigger, fancier computers came out. He self-taught himself how to program, especially in DOS. DOS was his thing. He didn't go into more detailed stuff that I know, but that doesn't say that he didn't. And I know even today that DOS is still a pertinent program, and there are companies that will hire you if you can demonstrate that you know how to do stuff with DOS. I had an opportunity at a company a couple of years ago that I turned down because of my mother's health and needs for her medical needs prevented me from working the hours that they wanted. And one of those was, did I have an understanding of DOS? So I have enough of an understanding to be able to fake it and learn if I needed to. So lots of people do this sort of thing. So yes, he could say that he has an education that's not complete and doesn't uphold that. Well, I don't want to bring in this information. I don't want to share these people's names. And there's another sidebar on that. It's established. And this is the sort of dirty pool that, in my honest opinion, the government and agencies within the government and large corporations, corporate America would do if they were to shut you down, is they're going to say, we don't have evidence of this individual. Now, when we talk about, well, somebody obviously tried to cover up his tracks, tried to take his education, prove, or, muddy the waters, or tried to erase his education tracks. And a lot of people think, oh, that's just so hard, it's so impossible to do. And I agree with that. It is hard. It is impossible to do. But, and I'm going to pause for a second and give you things. Give it a moment to think about. All right, then. Let's see. Let me get back into my situation. When I hit the pause button, I stopped the recording. So, fortunately, this software I'm using allowed me to go back and replay the first half of the recording. This is a pickup from that. So, if it seems a little disjointed, it probably will be. And it also occurred to me that this part of this, the conundrum of Robert Lazar and his past, his education, this sudden disappearance of proof after the fact warrants its own video. And I think I'm not going to, I can touch on a few things, but I think I'm going to do another video that focuses on the possibility of how easy it was, especially back then, to actually achieve this mysterious erasure of a person's history, at least documented history. Especially if the person in question is reluctant to give forth critical names of individuals who could verify that he did, and that this individual did not keep a whole lot of material from those days personally, and why they would do it. Keep in mind that back in the day, and I'll use one of my folders over here as an example. It is a document and paper trail. These are maps for, I also have a channel called Your Seat at the Table, which I occasionally will reference by mistake, where I review my role-playing game hobby, which is quite extensive, that sort of stuff. But, let that color your opinion on me. But anyway, back in the 80s, before, back in the 70s, so a lot of Bob Lazar's education starts in the late 70s and ends in the early 80s, and he begins his physical career in the early 80s. So prior to having computers in every aspect of our lives, they were rare, they were crude, they were clumsy, and they didn't use them extensively in accounting or personnel development, which we now will call human resources, right? Or whatever I guess the latest vernacular is for that term. So somewhere in a file cabinet at MIT would be a folder with any pertinent information revolving around a specific student. And it doesn't matter if that student only takes one class or completes a number of degrees at that location, there's going to be at least a single folder. And we're looking at how this stuff would potentially disappear. Now, not looking, just looking generically speaking. If you look at MIT as an example, back in the day, there would have been entire rooms devoted to files after files. And our government was the same way. And in some aspects, the government still does hard copy stuff because it's much harder to, much easier to hide if there's only one set. They don't make 10 duplicates. And here comes Frankie the shelter cat. So what are you doing, Frankie? You're just getting up from your nap and you're going to come over and be a pest? Yes, this is Frankie. We adopted her from a local animal shelter, and she sometimes gets to be a little too curious. She was part of a hoarder case. An elderly lady had some 70 cats that were alive, and when the cops were at the front door, she was tossing cats out the second floor window, thinking that she was saving them from being put down. Our state does not do that sort of thing. But anyway, we adopted her. So you go to those back in the day when I was a kid, when I went to school, there was book, folders and folders and folders. They didn't have them on computer. They didn't happen until the mid 80s, later, early to mid 80s. So in the late 70s and stuff, pretty much everything was still paper trail, and it would be in a big folder. So somebody, it doesn't have to be the government coming into the door and flashing a badge and saying, we're going to take these files. It could be somebody who has affiliation with the government or has a connection with certain elements of the government who gets a phone call who says, Joe, we need you to go pull Lazar's folder and send all that information to me, to us, and then forget he ever existed. Now, you would argue that, well, there was a lot of people who would know. But that's not true. I mean, even except for a handful of intimate people, perhaps instructors and maybe a few people he went to school with, the bulk of the people who work at MIT, he's just another face. He's just another number. He's not going to be remembered. I got to make another pause because she stepped out. I think close the door. Okay, so like I was saying, it would be not impossible for somebody who's in the connection of certain elements, and you don't necessarily even have to be involved with the super secret S4, Area 51, what have you, to make this sort of thing disappear. All you need to do is have somebody with the authority or the connections to contact somebody that works for or has access to the record rooms at MIT, and I'm just using MIT as an example, to walk in, open the particular cabinet that says Lazar, pull this information out, and walk off with it. Now, it takes a little bit more when they sit there and tell everybody, says, look, this guy never existed. Because you can't, let's just be truthful. People are people, and there's so many people out there who would take that as such a spectacular thing. It certainly isn't something that occurs very often. Otherwise, these people were going to gossip. Oh, this guy came in from, we don't know what government agency, but he flashed a government badge and he took this and he told us he was never there. Because that sort of stuff, well, that just argues for, we need to talk about it. We need to share. We need to gossip. So truth is, somebody could come in the middle of the day who worked at MIT but has connections and has access and just walked out with the guy's folders. And that's that, because there's nothing computerized at this point. And a lot of the old stuff doesn't get computerized till later, if ever. There's a reason, one of the reasons why big corporations and stuff, you keep storage rooms and storage facilities to keep handfuls of hang on to records, because nobody wants to spend the money and the time to go back through millions of old records and translate them and photocopy them into a computer system. Although that does exist, people do that. That's actually a career. I'm just saying. So theoretically, back in that day, it was real easy, much more easier than what you might consider doable. I mean, by today's standards, everything's digitized, everything's computerized. So we could go and we could say, oh, absolutely, without a doubt, we can just touch a button and put in a virus, and this guy just disappears off the face of the earth, etc., etc. But even then, that's not necessarily true, because especially in America, since America has this obsession with doing things half-assed, there's still a lot of paper trails. Which brings me to some of those other questions that I have yet to hear other people ask, and I'm not saying that they haven't been asked, but it's just that I have not yet come across a video or clip or anything of that nature. Now, the saying that they were asked. When we talk about education, and especially advanced education after high school, because up till high school, public education is free for a lot of people. After high school, somebody has to pay for this. Whether you pay for it out of your pocket, you get a grant or a diploma, or another company pays your education, what have you. You now create a separate paper trail. Well, you have another series of documents and papers and knowledge thereof that I owe a student loan, or I paid this place this money. So now not only do we have a personnel file of a student to have to make disappear. Somebody had to got access to the areas that handle the financing of the individuals, and that particular file had to have disappeared as well. And so it just shows you that it takes a bit more than just clicking a button or walking off with a single file or a folder to make somebody past disappear. Right. So when I look at, and I also stumbled across his master's degree at MIT is magnohydrodynamics, which is a pretty basically electrical hydro. How does energy flow? In my interpretation, if I'm wrong on that, by all means, put a comment down. Let me know what the hell it does. I didn't think of googling it and getting off onto a rabbit's trail. When we talk about education and money, right? We know he went to Pierce Junior College. We speculate Caltech. We speculate MIT. We also know that there's mention of California State University at Northridge. So potentially he went to 4 different educational facilities, institutions after high school. And there's no mention anywhere from anybody that I can tell, which doesn't mean that the 100 people didn't ask the question, is where's the money? Where did the money go? I'm under the understanding that his parents were modestly they weren't wealthy. I mean, I didn't run down that rabbit hole either. Is his family millionaires? I mean, obviously, despite all of his setbacks, Bob Lazar's done fairly well for himself. He's not rolling in money, but if you look at some of his toys and some of his access to whiz-bangs, obviously some of his companies were prolific enough to generate a decent income. He didn't make a whole lot of money working for S4 if you go by that W2 form, I can tell you that. And he acknowledges himself that he wasn't at S4 full time. He roughly was there 6 months, and out of that 6-month period, he probably wasn't there more than a handful of weeks collectively. He was there hit or miss. He'd come in part time. He'd come in late at night in the evenings and leave before morning, and they would call him when they wanted him. So he had to have other businesses. He had to have. Unless he had family money, or the government was just pulling money into an account that we can't find again. Once again, the missing paperwork for financing. Obviously, Bob Lazar had to have alternate income, which is one of the reasons he had these little businesses he started, or side jobs. He got a career at Los Alamos, and then stumbled across, there's a niche where somebody needs something done. I can create a company, and I can get a guy or two to help me, more or less get the guy or two to do most of the grunt work, and I can refurbish these radar detectors. So these little devices that were supposed to test people for having too much radiation on them or something like that, or whatever those doohickeys were. It wasn't his primary business or primary job there, although it's implied that that's what he was doing at Los Alamos as a contractor. Well, if he did that to make money, that probably opened the door to go to Los Alamos. He might be fudging or lying about the actual position as a full-on physicist at Los Alamos. I don't believe that he would have had enough education or world experience to warrant that kind of position there. That's just my personal opinion. That doesn't mean he didn't work at Los Alamos, nor does it mean as a contractor he didn't work at Los Alamos. Obviously, the inclinations are that he did work there. Whether he worked there specifically for them or as a third party is up in the air. And there's a lot of evidence, or suggestive evidence, and let's be honest, evidence is only evidence if it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Otherwise, it's just conjecture. It's potential proof, but not proof positive of something. You can have lots of evidence that does not actually pertain to a situation, and or can be misconstrued or twisted very easily. So the fact that if he did work as a third-party contractor, he still was at Los Alamos. He still worked there, even if it was indirectly. But there's evidence that he had to have an income to support himself and his wife. Aside from when he left Los Alamos to go to work at S4, the S4, by hit bits and pieces of the conversations he says, and the small amount of money that was on that W-2 tells me that he didn't make enough money from that particular position at that moment that he wouldn't have had to have a secondary job, which led him off into some misadventures during that period of time, and that's material for yet another video. Isn't it funny how one individual's life can make so many different possible scenarios for many other people to exploit or pursue? And frankly, I'm not going to ever get paid for any of this stuff. I don't have enough. I mean, you're looking at my channel. I have 2 subscribers. That's because those subscribers are me. I mean, I'm just saying this is not it's just an interesting thing for me to kill some time, and because I'm curious about this stuff. So we go back to that. How did he pay for it all? He obviously wasn't making gobs of money prior to his job at Los Alamos. And if he was a physicist at Los Alamos, he made some good money. He would have had to have some student debt. He would have had some student loans. Or would he? Was it possible that he paid for his education as he went along? He got jobs that paid just enough, or he invented these off-ball things. If you invent a jet car, you can't figure that you couldn't parlay that into some money, that you wouldn't find other people who would go, oh, I want a jet car. And it's implied that he was actually in racing. He was racing jet cars. So there was a modest industry for that particular material and the potential for winning those things. But we don't have any proof or evidence. There's nothing that's been presented that I know of. Nobody's gone off into that rabbit hole that I've seen. Why not pursue his short-time career as a jet car race enthusiast? I don't know that he himself actually raced, or he had a driver, but the man had some money. I mean, there's references to him having had a Lamborghini at one point. Exactly what Lamborghini and how much and how old or what condition it was in, or is another thing. But I haven't heard the term Lamborghini put alongside budget billing. So in order to have a Lamborghini, even a junky one, you had to have some money in your pockets. Just buying a used one can be in the tens and twenties of thousands of dollars, even if it don't run. But he says he's got one, and it's sitting out in his backyard. And this took place during one of the interviews that I had watched on YouTube. So go do your own homework. So how does he pay for it? Government grants. A government grant means he didn't have to pay it back. Maybe somebody. It seems that Bob Lazar picked up some interesting mentors or sponsors. What was the term for that? Romans were big on that. A patron. Perhaps he had some patrons that were not familiar with it, or some unspoken patrons, somebody that paid for those bills to help him get through. Or maybe the government was already interested in this individual. And on a side note, slightly reflective to that, let's just say I know somebody that is in my family, who I'm not going to name, who has an eclectic memory. And this person demonstrated great abilities to absorb just about everything they read or saw and remember in detail. This doesn't make them a super genius by any means, but it means they have access to an inborn library. They want to take a class, they read the instruction manual, and aside from understanding the practical practices, the practical applications of the material that they have access to, you can read a book on engine repair and then if you're eclectic, repeat that word and page to somebody, and yet still not know how to turn a wrench. You yourself cannot physically, all of the skill, you have all the material that should allow you to take a carburetor apart and put it back together again and make it work. But having the knack to do that, the patience to do that, the skilled use of tools, you just may not be able to achieve it. But this individual had a load of knowledge and the ability to retain knowledge at a 99.x% accuracy rate. This person started out in a college, university, and then got headhunted by the United States government, specifically the Air Force at the time, and then went on for a very strange career in the State Department. And it lasted for some 20-odd years, 25 years, and then they, quote, retired. They met another individual of similar bent and got married and lived in Hawaii. They are not allowed to travel outside the U.S. sphere of influence without special permission from the State Department because of gobs and gobs of access to information that this person knows. This person's a walking computer, or walking reservoir of knowledge, of learned material. So it's possible that somebody took interest and paid for all that education and stuff that he needed to have, and for reasons we don't know, and he doesn't want to speak about. He's reluctant to name a lot of names, and there's good reason. This is part, like I said, part and parcel for another video, but we'll still touch on it. And it's obvious because everybody talks about it or dances around it. Anytime he brings up names of colleagues, of friends, associates, people who have normal lives or have careers, some bad stuff's happened to them. People have gone out of their way to, especially in his earlier days, to mess with these people. It's implied or alluded to that the government or element agents within the government or in corporate America have made it their business, since they can't seem to shut up Lazar himself, that go after the people Lazar knows and cares about or associated, affiliated with. If they can scare off or drive off these people and remove them from the equation, then it just makes Bob Lazar's story much more harder to define and to prove, because he is, and that's the bell of me turning up the volume here. I don't know. Sometimes my volume's too high and you hear all kinds of background noises, like me fiddling my eyeglasses at the moment, changing paper. I got half a glass of Pepsi over here I'm slurping on, and the cat goes in and out of the door occasionally, and you still pick up bits and pieces from the TV and my wife in the living room. So once again, I'm not technically advanced enough to know how to spend my time making the most perfect video, and I'm not going to try. All I'm here to do is to get some stuff out of my head, discuss some things, share opinions and views, and entertain to a little bit. You can accept it, you don't accept it. I could pay for an extra extension. This particular software is free, but it only limits me to 4 scenes, so I can only flip between 4 different things, and I'm not fixing on doing, spending an extra $6 a month, because my budget just doesn't allow it to have more access to this stuff. Thankfully for the government stimulus, I actually had enough money to go buy me a new laptop yesterday, which I have not processed yet. It has got a bigger CPU, because this one here has CPU issues. This software pushes the limit of what my laptop's capable, and sometimes it has quirks. So just like Bob Lazar, he's full of quirks. There's things that don't add up. There's questions that lead to more questions, or it makes it really easy for people to dismiss him outright. And as I said, the biggest controversy, and I said this at the beginning of this video, the biggest controversy isn't what he said he saw and did at S4. It's his background, the lack thereof of his education specifically, or the fact that he himself adds to his own mystique, without either intentionally and by design, or because he is what he is, and he honestly is an honest person who found himself in a very, very strange and different place. And he went down that rabbit hole and discovered something he was unprepared to discover, and parts of him still to this day are reluctant to acknowledge the obvious that everybody else wants to point out, because it's ridiculous in his mind. He doesn't care about UFOs. He doesn't care about the aliens. He doesn't want to. He's not an alien enthusiast. He's not an advocate. He goes out of his way to make that out when he does do videos, and he's done fewer and fewer, from what I can see on YouTube, fewer and fewer of these interviews as he's gotten older, and most of what he says is still the same stuff. So he's still spinning the same yarn that he was in the late 80s, early 90s. So, returning full circle, Pierce Junior College, which would give him his preliminaries to get into Caltech, where he earns an electronics master's, so he says. He did some time at California State University at Northridge, which is not Caltech as best I can say, but it's affiliated with the education system, so he probably took some secondary courses and subsistent material, where there's certain things you need to have to build on the degree, etc. Now, going back a little bit, as I did my research, you do not need to have a PhD to do what he did. And I made the argument in my first video that I believe that there's good reason why the government would not want top physicists involved in one of these things, these super secret programs. Now, there's a suggestion that this was all a plan or a plot to get somebody in and then let them go so they could discredit them, but at the same time start getting this information out to the public in such a manner that they could blow it off and poo-poo it. And let's acknowledge, we are far more acceptable to the idea of aliens today than any other time in history. If you'd gone back, all you have to do is go back to the 30s, or was it the 20s, when Orson Welles did War of the Worlds and on the radio, and it was so believable that tens of thousands of people panicked on the East Coast. They were leaving the cities, they were rushing into the countryside. There were people running around shooting water towers in the countryside because they, honest to God, thought the aliens were invading and New York was burning, etc., etc. So there's always those people. And then later in the 70s and 60s, specifically the 70s, we see this resurgence of the radical Christian right, the hardcore, and I'm not an atheist by any means, but there's a lot of diehard religious Christian types and other religion types that just are so oblivious to the realities of the world that they would not handle the concept of aliens existing in truth. They would panic. It's just like today. When we look at this pandemic, this COVID-19 going on right now, there are so many elements of the United States federal government that are in denial or outright delusional, that is spooky. And then there's some that are so self-centered. It's all about their particular view and their particular take on how they are supposed to pursue things, to the point where they're doing far more damage to our country and our economy than they're helping. And they're oblivious to it because they just cannot give up their niche of power. They cannot give up their view. They cannot comprehend the possibility of somebody else's view being more correct. And I'm not going to go off on a tirade on that because that's some of the early videos I did for this channel. And you see a few of them, you'll know where I stand when it comes to our president. But I'm scared to death of what some of the stuff that's been going on. And especially the fact that you're on public media on a daily basis, spewing out lies and outright falsehoods and making dangerous suggestions. And there's a core group of people out there who take your word as gospel. This is a bad thing for democracy. This man is a bad element, and we cannot get rid of that guy fast enough. The sucky ass part is that the guy that the other side is upholding as the potential replacement, is the lesser of two evils. Let's put it that way. So anyway, so you don't need a PhD to get these jobs. You also do not need to have a thesis in order to get a master's degree, or a PhD for that matter, because I Googled this stuff. And contrary to popular belief, the thesis master's degree is not the only path to the doctorate studies. You can enroll without creating a thesis. You do not need to have a thesis, though that are a bit rare. But there are exceptions, and within the institutions and individuals, exceptions. So in the case of somebody who's naturally inclined to a specific field and has great knowledge in it, the fact that his living existence is an active thesis, could allow the people in charge to just rubber stamp to say you don't need it, or we'll forego it. So to say that, my point is some programs don't require you to have a thesis or dissertation, but they are rare in some aspects. And we asked the question, how did he pay for everything? Obviously, there's no evidence that the man has a load of finances to his, he's made a decent living in his own way, but he didn't start out with a whole pile of money. But he also apparently didn't generate a huge pile of debt. Now, a little bit of a side note on that's connected. The debt for college and universities 30 years ago was far, far less than it is today. The cost of going to school today is skyrocketed to the point of almost being absurd. You're going to spend the first 10 years of your career trying to pay off your education to get that career. And to me, that is so detrimental. That is part of the corporate American industry issue. Corporate education. These huge institutions of learning are vast pools of money generating sources, and they've gotten greedy, or they've gotten expensive because in order to support them, those people that support the universities are greedy and demand more money from the universities. In any case, it's much harder to get a degree today without going into great debt, without owing somebody, whether it's the government or a private business, which, if you look at the debt from a perspective of an economic thing, you generate $100,000 debt getting a master's degree or a doctorate degree today for 3 or 4 years. And I think that's underestimating the cost of these things. And who does this money owe to? It's owed to corporate banks of America, these big, massive financial institutions who are going to make loads of interest off of you. And if you got the government grant money from the government, well, they're still handling it. These corporate institutions handle a lot of it, and they get a cut of it. Meanwhile, you're paying back Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam gets a percentage in return for loaning you this money. So the fact is, today, by today's standards, it's much harder, almost impossible, not to have some form of financial debt while putting yourself through college. So unless you have a deep pool of money to begin with, your family has deep pockets, it's not going to happen. Bob Lazar's family, there's no indication that he came from that kind of a family. I don't know that he did or he didn't, but I know that the question is something that could be raised and looked into. Where did the money go? Follow the money trail. Where's the finances? How long did it take him to pay back? If he had student loans, how long did he pay back? In those days, it would make much easier to pay back. In fact, there were the old adage, well, I worked my way through college. Well, it's much harder to do, almost impossible to do today. But you go back 30, 40 years, it was possible to have a job and go to school full time and pay the majority of your needs while going to school and not incurring that huge debt. That's a big part of our economic problems today. In order to get a decent education, to get a decent job, you need a load of debt. It's just the way the system works. We are, indenturing ourselves to the facility, to the institution. We indenture ourselves to the banks to buy our homes and to buy our cars. And we indenture ourselves to the credit unions to buy the little things in life that we want to enjoy ourselves. And it's a vicious cycle. And with our economy in bad shape right now in this country, 30-odd million people out of work in 6 weeks is just unheard of. And I expect there to be a lot of fallout from this that has yet to come. I've been very fortunate. The wife and I are hanging on by our toenails, but we managed to stay and meet all of our goals and actually have just a little bit left over, which in order for me to buy a laptop. But it won't keep going that way. And it's either we get back to work and people deal with it, or the government figures out a way to help keep us afloat, or we're going to be in trouble. And all these big people, these 1%ers that are laughing and cackling and still making loads of money through this thing, don't understand that big business needs the little guys to support them. If we can't afford to go out to our restaurants, those restaurants can't buy the goods and resources and produce that they need to stay open. Can't pay their people to stay open. They can't pay their taxes. They can't pay their insurance. They can't pay their debts to the big corporations. In turn, those companies that support those businesses take a hit. That produce company that produces or provides the produce suddenly has less income and less revenue. See, it's all interlinked, but so many people want to look at and put their heads in the sand or pretend that it's not, especially at the upper levels, because they're in denial, and they've always been in denial. And we help that situation, and we don't do nothing about it. That's little guys. Well, what do you do? So, where's the paper trail? Where's the education? My literal opinion is I do believe Bob Lazar attended Caltech. I believe that he attended MIT. I believe that he does have a master's degree in electronics. He has all the evidence of a man who knows his business around electronics. I believe that he believes that he has a master's degree in fancy $14 word magnetohydrodynamics degree from MIT. He very well may have pursued those classes and courses there. I think he did, because he has that is a pretty specialized area of expertise, which would open some specific doors for potential people. I believe that somebody did pull the records of a lot of his evidence, that the muddied waters are so muddied that it's just impossible to get a true picture of his education situation. And in part because he himself is protecting other people by not flapping out, here's what I have, here's my evidence. I also believe, and I know this from personal experience, I don't have very much of my educational material that I used when I went to school. I do have a couple of the school books, course books laying around. Bob Lazar probably does too. You wouldn't know that that's what they are, and he's not willing to point them out to you because it's no proof. Now, I bought my books at the college bookstore, which has stamps inside the and covers, which is additional proof that I bought them. That doesn't necessarily mean I bought them to go to the college courses. Doesn't mean I bought them actually. I could have just went to the campus bookstore and bought them, or I could have bought them secondhand. Except these are brand new books. They were used once and look nice on the shelf collecting dust. I don't. Like I said, I have a diploma. And I have a little piece of paper that says I got a 4.0 GPA, and they're all sitting in a lockbox because I have no reason to put them on a wall somewhere. They just will collect dust, and frankly, my current job situation has absolutely nothing to do with my education, which isn't a unique situation. So many people go to college, university for a specific thing and end up doing something completely unrelated to that thing. So there's something else to take into note. Even if Bob Lazar doesn't have the high-level education that people suggest that he has, that he himself says he does, even if he does have it, the education he has doesn't seem to lend itself to a physicist position at Los Alamos. Well, what does? What exactly was Los Alamos' ideal on what this guy was going to do? He's a master's in electronics, which I don't know a whole lot of institutions and scientific resource facilities today that aren't chock-a-block full of electronics. And you need people to not only understand how to fix them and how to operate them, but how the physics work around them, how these things do what they do. Now, in his case, we're talking theoretical physics and electronics, how he understands the theories behind how things work, or practical experience, right? He shows elements of both of that. And his personal career choices of his personal businesses lend credence to that. He just hands that stuff out hand to fist. Now, there's also been some conjecture on how he talks. When he talks about his education and his knowledge, he seems to be able to target the audience he's currently with. He has enough information to impress. So when we went on Joe Rogan, he didn't come out and start talking in formulas and theoretics and such high-level stuff that you would need a master's degree yourself to understand half of what he's saying, because he knows his audience isn't Joe Rogan, but it's the general public of America or the world, and the Joe Blows and the Jane Blows of the world, people like me and you, for the most part, who wouldn't have a clue if he starts talking mumbo jumbo. That's shop. Let's talk shop. Well, he can't talk shop in front of Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan's a pretty savvy individual. He's pretty knowledgeable. Is he highly educated in hydrodynamic, whatever the hell this is, hydrodynamics? Hell no, he's not. He's a comedian and a podcast journalist and a well-rounded individual who's very curious. I like Joe Rogan in that aspect. There's some elements about him I don't care about, but that's just personal. We can't all care about. But I do like the way that he tries to broaden his horizons, and he approaches things with a fairly open mind. He doesn't just shut the book. I also agree with how he handles skeptics. It's so damn easy to be a skeptic, isn't it? I don't believe. Well, what do you believe? Well, I don't believe that you need to know what I believe, right? Bullshit. If you're going to be a skeptic, let's have some solid evidence. At least approach everything with an open mind. Give it a fair view and shake. And Joe Rogan will call you out on it if you say you're a skeptic and you're being obtuse. So, that being said, my opinion is the man does have this education. Whether or not he has pieces of paper to prove it makes no difference. Whether or not he had help paying for his debts or his debts disappeared, because if you think about that and this just popped in my brain, if you think about it, if you're going in, the government's going in, they're going to erase your history, your academic history, and they're going to pull those folders. They're going to walk in, they're going to tell somebody that's already inside that institution, send me this, and this suddenly disappears. That same person's going to go to the finance department and say, give me that, and this disappears. So one day, Lazar owes a bunch of money and then the next day he doesn't because the government made it disappear. Right? Think about that for a second. So, yeah, I think his education exists. He demonstrates all the practical knowledge that a layman would understand and more. They argue that if you put him in front of another physicist, another specialist, and then they start taking him apart. They start debunking him right on the spot. They start showing that he doesn't have their level of education. I conjecture that they are they are already in their mind dismissing this man, and they're going to do that. And the fact that he doesn't sit down in a room full of people who are physicists with that fancy magno-hydrodynamics degree and have a dissertation on how plasma flows through something, etc., and they all do those $20 words that are they're more than 20 letters to them, and acronyms that only people in the industry or the education is going to understand what the other guy's saying, and you and I wouldn't have a freaking clue what the heck they're talking about, and we would not be able to say whether or not that other guy on the other side of the table has a grudge or has a narrow view of the scenario. I mean, I'm a professional physicist in this blah 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 field, and you're bringing me in to debunk a nut. What's wrong with you people? I mean, that would be the perspective. Bob Lazar, I think I have no evidence because I've never seen a videotape of an interview between him and a board of physicists in this high-level electronics and so on and so forth. So without having seen that video, how can I be 100% sure? And some Joe Blow Q claiming to be a physicist comes up at one of those Q&A sessions that he occasionally pops up at and starts firing off those fancy words. I've never seen one of those either. Now, if you have, point them out to me, talk about it to me. I mean, I'd like to hear about it. I'd like to see it. I don't think it's pertinent to the question. I think one of the reasons he was picked potentially for this S4 situation was because he's such a off-the-cuff individual. He's educated, he's smart, he's intelligent, he's savvy in his field. He's very focused on specific elements of that. He doesn't go off on tangents. I don't see him ever going off on tangents unless it's something that really interests him. That he's also human. He's also made some pretty strange and questionable behavior and actions that cost him in his personal life and in his academic life, in his career. So he's self-employed. So somebody who's looking for somebody who is so not carbon cookie cutter cut out of the academia of the top levels of the intellectual sections of our society, who's going to look at something that's so out there, that's so exotic, that's so beyond. Even Lazar makes these comments every day. So he says it's just the very idea of what I've seen and what I worked with or what I fiddled with, which is more appropriate to what he's saying, because he's acknowledging they had some theoretical breakthroughs, but they did very little in a short period of time. And that's another video pending. That what can you do? Why was his time was so short? There was so little, yet so much. And part of it, I think, a lot was tossed at him to see how he would respond and handle, and he handled it the way he did, which cost him that possible future career in that black tank underground scenario that nobody talks about. He's not Barry. He's not the Barry guy. Barry's a different kind of person. Barry's the kind that comes from those top-notch academics that get into a situation and then so focused on that situation that that's the only thing they want to know and deal with. Bob Lazar is a much wider, curious individual with far more different interests and variety of interests, and probably gets bored fairly easy and finds something else to get himself involved in. So the education's there. The proof isn't. It's in bits and pieces, and even those bits and pieces are bare crumbs. There's no evidence of financing, but yet I still think he did. He talks like he knows what he's doing. And there's just enough people who say, oh, I knew him when he was at Caltech. I talked to him. There are some. But most people, most common people that he would have revolved around interacted with in those places would be very reluctant to put themselves up in a spotlight next to him with an arm around him and say, well, yeah, old Bob and me, we used to go out for beers after class, and we were struggling on this particular thing that we were doing there for, we got to take this, part of the course was we had to develop this thing, or we had to get the mathematics figured out for this thing, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because they have academic careers too, and you don't attach yourself to somebody like Bob Lazar without taking a hit one way or another. So there's good evidence, good reason for why he can't put a bunch of stuff out. And the fact is, he doesn't repeatedly makes a point of not hanging people out to dry. He does not throw people under the bus, even though that hurts him. Think about that. He knows names. He knows people. He doesn't want to hurt them, or to muddle them up, or to wreck their careers, or cause them problems. So he refuses to do it. Because if you look at him, that's the kind of guy he seems to be. And he's also not a grandizer. He doesn't stand out there thumping his chest and screaming and yelling at the wind and howling at the moon and trying to get a whole bunch of, be nice, be nice. He's no President Trump. He's not even in the same, category. It's not about him. It just is. So I think he does have, at the end, my opinion, he does have the education. He did go to these places. Simple as that. Give me your thoughts, your opinions, whatever you think, whatever you don't think, don't care. Good luck. Meanwhile, keep an open mind in the world. Be mindful of what's going on. Pay attention. We're in a society today when the top elected officials of our government can go on national television or world television and make comments and suggestions, and then 20 minutes later say they didn't, and say that, oh, it was made up, or I was joking, or it's fake media. So what you're watching with your own eyes and listening to your own ears is obviously fake, according to certain people. And the truth is, there is a possibility for that technology to do that. But is it really being done that? Are we living in that world? Or do we just have some crackpots out there that are really, really doing a bad job at what they were hired to do? And they're doing everything they can to make it look like somebody else is the problem. And meanwhile, Bob Lazar's the world come out with some incredible stuff, believable or not, truth or not, and they're easily discredited, or not so easily discredited, right? Just think about it. Until next time.